Hello everyone, and welcome to week 10 of Poll 205, Women in Politics. Now, today we're talking about women in Congress. So up until this point, we've spent a lot of time talking about why women run for office, or differences in how men and women campaign and communicate with voters. And today, we're going to talk about whether men and women in government actually do their jobs differently. So with that being said, let's get started. So we've already talked a lot about general stereotypic trait assessments of male and female politicians. Generally, most people associate women with feminine traits like compassion, empathy, and understanding, while male politicians are generally associated with more masculine traits like being assertive, aggressive, and decisive. But despite these differences, most Americans, in fact about 75%, believe that men and women are equally effective at governing and legislating. And so while we might think that men and women possess different traits, the point is that these trait differences aren't seen as weaknesses, but rather offer a different perspective to the political process that makes politics more diverse and more representative. So if we want to empirically assess whether men or women do their jobs differently in any meaningful way, we first have to identify the constructs of what it means to effectively govern in the first place. In other words, if we want to know whether men or women are more effective at governing, we first have to define what effective governance means. So there are four main areas that we can examine. First, we can look at differences between men and women's interpersonal relationships in Congress. Are women more collegial than men, as the feminine stereotype might suggest? Are they more likely to be bipartisan and work with members across the aisle? Second, do men and women have different legislative agendas? For example, are women more concerned with legislating on women's issues rather than issues that could be considered to affect everyone equally? Third, do women vote differently than men when it comes to procedural voting behavior? For instance, are men more likely to filibuster and stall the debate, or do we see stronger consensus among women to adjourn debates and move bills quickly through Congress? And lastly, fourth, are women more likely than men to vote yes on certain types of bills? Are there any significant differences in how men and women in Congress sponsor or co-sponsor certain types of legislation? So let's examine each of these in a little bit more detail. Let's start off with examining the extent of interpersonal relationships between men and women in Congress. On page 106 from the Lawless and Fox book, the authors use some really unique examples to investigate whether men or women are more collegial in Congress. So throughout the year, the U.S. Congress sponsors a variety of social events that encourage its members to put a pause on the debate and get to know each other a little bit better, and dare I say, even get a little friendly with each other. And one of these events is the annual Senate Secret Santa, where senators exchange small gifts with one another. And it's just hilarious when they share what they've received or what they've given on social media. Like, just check out Senate Secret Santa on Twitter. One year, it's going to be hard for me to get through this. One year, Cory Booker wrote a poem for Tom Carper, and then Tom Carper gave someone else an Adele CD, and I don't know why that gets me so much, but it's just super funny to me. At any rate, it's a really lighthearted event that is geared at fostering collegiality and good cheer among senators. And while participation is optional, it's rather intriguing that almost 50% of women senators participate in the Secret Santa festivities, while only about 34% of male senators take part in the Senate Secret Santa. Another lighthearted event that aims to garner bipartisan participation is Seersucker Thursday, a tradition that dates back to the mid-1990s. So each spring, the Senate hosts a seersucker fashion show in which both men and women are encouraged to participate. And in fact, it wasn't even until 2004 when California Senator Dianne Feinstein suggested women in the Senate also dress up and give their male colleagues a run for their money. And today, while women only make up about a quarter of the Senate's overall representation, the proportion of women who participate in Seersucker Thursday, about 33%, is nearly 4 times greater than the proportion of men, about 8%, who participate in the event. Lastly, the Congressional Baseball Game is an annual charity event played each summer by members of both the U.S. House and Senate, a tradition that dates all the way back to 1909. And this is one of my favorite team-building traditions in the U.S. Congress because even though it's organized as an opportunity for members of Congress to work together and raise money for charities, but the teams are divided between Democrats and Republicans. And really, it's just an opportunity for prime-time trash talk. So let's take a look at one of the previous congressional baseball games, some media coverage of that to give you an example.
Congressional baseball game, great timeless tradition.
Better like Coors Light.
Can't get over the irony or the fun of like members of Congress playing ball on a field paid for by lobbyists.
I've never known that.
So we make a lot of jokes about the Congressional baseball game, but there's a reason for it, and that's for raising money for charity. They just gave a check for $300,000 for a charity for children.
How are you doing?
I'm doing great.
What's your name?
My name is Sama.
Hi, Sama. Good to be with you.
A cool 90 degrees to start off this game. What position they have you today, center?
I'm an outfielder. We'll see where they put me.
The first game as a presidential candidate. Do they treat you any different?
No, I think they treat me worse.
You are the young bucks of the game today because there's a lot of geriatrics here. Are you going to be soft on them?
Laugh at that?
The Republican staffers all get drunk on this side and cheer for their bosses.
Oh, Republicans. Absolutely. Why is that? Why? Because I'm thoroughbred.
And the Democratic staffers all get drunk on this side and cheer for their bosses.
So surreal. The racing presidents are running, and they're running straight toward the real president, President Obama. Rand Paul's on deck, and Obama's standing right there. It should be very interesting to see. Paul really squelched an opportunity.
Sounds like his presidential campaign.
How do you trash talk at the Congressional baseball game?
I bet your bill never got out of committee since last Congress. Call that an amendment? My intern could have written that.
After a sweaty, hard fight, 5-2 Democrats at the end.
So while the Congressional Baseball Game has been an institutional tradition for over a century, the Women's Congressional Softball Game is a relatively recent phenomenon that began in 2009. Since, historically, there's been a dearth of women elected to Congress, the Women's Congressional Softball Game divides the teams between women in Congress and women in the D.C. press corps. And together, they work to raise money for the Young Survival Coalition, an international advocacy network that works to empower young women with breast cancer. And even though the institutional histories of both the Congressional Baseball Game and the Congressional Softball Game are vastly different, women are almost twice as likely than men to participate in the congressional version of America's favorite pastime. So from Secret Santa gift giving, to high fashion steaks on Capitol Hill, to stepping up to the plate, women in Congress are significantly more likely than their male counterparts to participate in these team-building social activities that ostensibly foster collegiality and cooperation. But does this collegiality outside of Capitol Hill translate to cooperation in the workplace? So generally, when we talk about cooperation in U.S. politics, we're talking about bipartisanship, which refers to individuals of different parties working together. And one of the biggest problems that you hear about in American politics today is that people in Congress are too polarized. They can't compromise and they can't get anything done. Well, if women are more likely to engage in cooperative activities and place a higher premium on cooperation, then are women also more likely to be bipartisan? And well, the short answer is no. Politics is largely still dominated by partisan divisions, meaning Democrats work with Democrats and Republicans work with Republicans. And in today's political landscape, we treat compromise as a dirty word. Republicans were furious at John McCain when he broke with party consensus and voted against repealing the Affordable Care Act. It happened again when a handful of Democrats opposed the impeachment inquiry of Donald Trump. And it happened again just a couple weeks ago when the Republican Senator Susan Collins defected against the Republican Party and voted no on the Supreme Court nomination of Amy Coney Barrett. So voting coalitions in Congress are strongly based upon partisan allegiances, not gender. And as the evidence suggests from your book, there are no statistically significant differences between men and women when it comes to being more bipartisan. So what are the predictors of bipartisanship? Well, age is probably the most significant factor. Members of Congress who are under 45 are significantly more bipartisan than older members of Congress. And there's a lot of generational effects that explain this behavior, but by and large, younger Americans are more progressive, more socially liberal, and this leads to greater agreement among younger cohorts of Congress. Regionalism is also a huge predictor of bipartisanship. I mean, just look at the regional differences in the bipartisan index for 2019. Darker colors indicate more bipartisan senators, while lighter colors indicate less bipartisanship among senators. So not surprisingly, your solid Republican South is pretty light. We know that elections tend to be far less competitive in the South, and we know that among these states in the South, most of them tend to operate under one-party government, meaning that one party controls the House, the Senate, and the gubernatorial offices here. And we see the same thing with solid liberal control. Which states are generally the most blue? California, Vermont, Connecticut, Rhode Island, Washington, Hawaii. And notice that the senators here are the least bipartisan. And there's no incentive to be bipartisan, right? These states, both in the South and the Northeast, are known for being solidly liberal or conservative. So where does bipartisanship exist? Notice any patterns here? It's almost exclusive to your battleground states. Just compare this map to the 2020 electoral map. The most bipartisan states also tend to be swing states. These are some of the few states left where elections are consistently competitive. So it's not surprising that senators from these states are more inclined to sign on to different types of legislation that make them more appealing to both the Democrats and Republicans that they represent. So the factors that influence how bipartisan a politician acts is more dependent on broader political structures and less reliant on identity characteristics. And this is exactly why we also don't see any gender differences between men and women on procedural votes or substantive votes, which are the final 2 points of investigation in this lecture. So notice on page 108 of Fox and Lawless that there are virtually no differences in how men and women politicians vote on procedural matters. This is important because it helps us chip away at stereotypes about how women govern. If women are supposed to be blinded by compassion and are hyper-focused on cooperation, then we might expect women to vote on procedural matters in a way that would speed up bills through Congress. Or we might expect them to spend less time filibustering and more time trying to convince members to adjourn the debate and move on with the agenda. But according to empirical analyses, women vote on procedural matters almost identically to their male colleagues. The Lawless and Fox chapter also comes to similar conclusions regarding substantive votes. So women politicians are not drastically more liberal than male politicians. They're also no more likely to vote on or support women's issues outside of the boundaries of their own partisan allegiance. In other words, partisanship is the driving factor of voting behavior in Congress, not gender. So it's really not all that surprising that the only area we see women performing significantly different than their male colleagues is in scenarios which are void of politics and partisanship completely. Though this isn't to suggest that women's participation in politics doesn't bring anything unique to the table, it's just that these differences are only really clear when partisanship isn't front and center. In fact, there's a great amount of political science literature that suggests women sponsor more bills than their male colleagues, they get more federal funds for their constituents, and bills sponsored by women often survive committee longer. And lastly, perhaps one of the greatest contributions of women in elected office is the example that they set for young girls and women. There is a plethora of political science studies that suggest that women voters are more politically active when they live in a district represented by women. When women are represented by female U.S. senators, they're more likely to report being engaged in politics and more likely to know their senator's voting record. And finally, when young girls see women in positions of power, they're more likely to be politically engaged themselves, more likely to be engaged with their communities, and more likely to express ambitious career trajectories. So despite the fact that a lot of what goes on in politics remains dominated by partisanship and party elites, there's much more to American politics than just liberalism and conservatism, and Democrats and Republicans. So to sum up the theme of this week's lecture, I think it's only appropriate that we end with a brief clip of the historic speech Kamala Harris gave as the first woman and the first woman of color as Vice President-elect of the United States. So overall, thanks for watching, and I hope you guys have a great week.
We are so grateful to Joe and Jill for welcoming our family into theirs on this incredible journey. And to the woman most responsible for my presence here today, my mother, Shyamala Gopalan Harris, who is always in our hearts. When she came here from India at the age of 19, she maybe didn't quite imagine this moment. But she believed so deeply in an America where a moment like this is possible. And so I am thinking about her and about the generations of women, Black women, Asian, white, Latina, Native American women, who throughout our nation's history have paved the way for this moment tonight. Women who fought and sacrificed so much for equality and liberty and justice for all, including the Black women who are often, too often, overlooked, but so often prove they are the backbone of our democracy. All the women who have worked to secure and protect the right to vote for over a century, 100 years ago with the 19th Amendment, 55 years ago with the Voting Rights Act, and now in 2020 with a new generation of women in our country who cast their ballots and continued the fight for their fundamental right to vote and be heard. Tonight, I reflect on their struggle, their determination, and the strength of their vision to see what can be unburdened by what has been. And I stand on their shoulders. And what a testament it is to Joe's character that he had the audacity to break one of the most substantial barriers that exists in our country and select a woman as his vice president. But while I may be the first woman in this office, I will not be the last. Because every little girl watching tonight sees that this is a country of possibilities. And to the children of our country, regardless of your gender, our country has sent you a clear message. Dream with ambition, lead with conviction, and see yourselves in a way that others may not, simply because they've never seen it before. But know that we will applaud you every step of the way. And to the American people, no matter who you voted for, I will strive to be a vice president, like Joe was to President Obama, loyal, honest, and prepared, waking up every day thinking of you and your family. Because now is when the real work begins. The hard work, the necessary work, the good work, the essential work to save lives and beat this epidemic, to rebuild our economy so it works for working people, to root out systemic racism in our justice system and society, to combat the climate crisis, to unite our country and heal the soul of our nation. And the road ahead will not be easy, but America is ready, and so are Joe and I. We have elected a president who represents the best in us, a leader the world will respect and our children will look up to, a commander-in-chief who will respect our troops and keep our country safe, and a president for all Americans.